Brothers and sisters, what I am about to share is not just a narrative. It's a testimony that touches the depths of the heart. Imagine a small, forgotten town, surrounded by arid mountains and dirt roads. A community of Christians lived there, simple men and women but firm in their faith. Every week, even under threats and hostile stares, they gathered in a small church made of rough bricks, with wooden benches and a makeshift zinc roof. There was no luxury, but there was something that money cannot buy: the presence of God. It was a Sunday night. The wind was blowing hard, carrying the distant sound of motorcycles crossing the dark roads. Inside the church, however, peace reigned. Children sat on the floor repeating verses. Women sang soft hymns, and Pastor Elias, a man with gray hair and a serene voice, read aloud, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Suddenly, a young man named Samuel, sitting in the front pew, whispered, "Pastor, did you hear that? It sounds like motor engines." Elias sighed, closed the Bible, and replied in a firm tone, "I did, my son. But we are here to worship, and while we pray, God is our shield." These words brought relief to some, but fear hung like a shadow. Everyone knew that in that region, violent groups had sworn to silence the Christian faith. Even so, no one budged. They were there because they believed in an impossible miracle, even when everything seemed to rise up against them. The service continued. Hymns were sung through tears, and every prayer ascended like incense to heaven. But the noise of motorcycles got closer until it was impossible to ignore. A metallic crash echoed. The front gate was kicked in hard. Shouts from armed men cut through the night. "Open up! Open up now!" The children began to cry. Mothers hugged their children, trying to hide them under the benches. Some men in the church exchanged glances, but they were unarmed, with no chance of resisting. Pastor Elias stood up and said with a trembling yet determined voice, "Don't be afraid. Remember, if God is for us, who can be against us?" At that moment, the doors were kicked down. 4 masked men entered, armed with machetes and sticks. The tallest of them shouted, "You were warned. No one here has the right to invoke this foreign god." Silence spread. Only the muffled crying of the children echoed. The hearts of the faithful seemed to beat faster than the sound of the aggressor's steps. The atmosphere of peace gave way to tension, but something supernatural was also in the air: the courage that springs up when there is no other way out. An elderly woman named Ruth slowly stood up. Her eyes were teary, but her voice was firm. "You may hurt us, but you cannot silence our Lord. He is greater than any weapon." One of the invaders advanced toward her, raising the machete. But before he could act, another man in the church shouted, "Jesus, have mercy on us." The cry echoed and spread like fire. Suddenly, dozens of voices began to pray at the same time. The noise of threats was swallowed by the sound of faith. Hands were raised, tears streamed down, and every word seemed to pierce the walls of that church. And here I have to ask you who are listening now, if you were there that night surrounded by enemies, would you have the courage to pray out loud? Or would fear silence you? Write your answer in the comments, because your testimony might be the hope someone needs today. At that instant, it seemed like everything was reaching a breaking point. But little did they know they were about to experience the beginning of an impossible miracle that would forever change the history of that community. The wide-open doors slammed against the wall violently, and the metallic sound echoed like thunder inside the small church. The invaders entered, kicking over benches and smashing windows, spreading terror. The most aggressive one pointed his machete at Pastor Elias and yelled, "I warned you that if you met again you would pay dearly." The children were crying loudly, clutching their mothers. Some men tried to form a human shield, but they were empty-handed, with no chance against sharp weapons. A young woman named Miriam held her younger sister's hand tightly and whispered, "Don't let go. Don't let go of me. Jesus is with us." The aggressors began pushing the worshippers against the wall. One of them knocked over a stack of hymnals and stomped on them, laughing. The sound of tearing paper seemed to mock the faith echoing in those walls. "Where is your God now?" mocked the tallest masked man. "I want to see if he shows up to save you." Pastor Elias, still standing, took a deep breath and replied with a firm voice, even in the face of the threat, "The Lord does not abandon us. You may destroy this place, but you cannot destroy our faith." One of the invaders shoved him hard. Elias fell to his knees, but instead of crying out, he raised his hands and began to pray aloud. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." This unexpected gesture confused the attackers. For an instant, silence reigned, interrupted only by the whispered prayers that began to spring up from various parts of the church. Mothers prayed, clutching their children. Young people cried out with closed eyes, and even the most timid raised their voices. The atmosphere, which should have been one of fear, was filled with a supernatural courage. But the violence had not yet ceased. One of the men kicked over a lantern, spreading fire across the floor. The panic intensified. People tried to put out the flames with their feet while others knelt crying. "Shut up!" roared the group leader. "No one leaves here until they learn that this God of yours is powerless." Even so, the elderly woman Ruth got up with difficulty and looked the aggressor in the eyes. Her voice, though weak, sounded like a trumpet. "You have no power over us. The Lord of hosts fights for his people." The invaders laughed mockingly, but it was visible that something in their expressions was beginning to waver. Some were trembling, others looked around, as if realizing they were not alone. And I have to ask you who are following this testimony. If your faith were attacked in this way, would you have the courage to stand firm, or would you be silent in the face of the threat? Think about it. Because that night, inside that small church, the enemy believed he would be victorious. But what was about to happen would show that an impossible miracle was on its way. The fire was still crackling in the corner of the small church, illuminating the rough brick walls with dancing shadows. The smell of smoke mixed with sweat and fear. The children cried, the invaders shouted, but amidst all this chaos, something unexpected began to happen. First, a soft voice arose, that of Miriam, the young woman who was holding her sister's hand. Even trembling, she began to sing softly, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee." The aggressors exchanged glances, laughing mockingly. One of them kicked a bench and yelled, "Silence that girl now!" But no one could silence her. Miriam's voice seemed to gain strength with every word. Soon other women joined the song, then the men, and in a matter of minutes, the entire congregation was singing the hymn together, as if fear had turned into courage. The sound of prayers and songs echoed louder than the invaders' shouts. The group leader tried to assert authority, brandishing the machete in the air. "You are crazy. You should be begging for your lives, not singing." Pastor Elias, still kneeling, raised his voice. "We have already surrendered our lives to the Lord. You can touch our bodies, but you cannot tear the presence of God from our hearts." Those words pierced the atmosphere like an arrow. The faithful, in tears, began to pray in unison. "Lord, show your glory. Lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil." It was impossible to ignore. Even the aggressors, who entered filled with rage, began to hesitate. Their hands were trembling. Their looks revealed something between anger and confusion. The fire seemed to diminish on its own, as if an invisible breeze were extinguishing the flames. Ruth, the elderly woman who had stood up earlier, stretched her frail hands toward the sky and declared with a firm voice, "The Lord is our refuge and strength. No weapon forged against us shall prosper." At that moment, one of the invaders let his machete drop to the ground. The metallic sound echoed like thunder in the ensuing silence. He stepped back, looking at the faithful as if he saw something no one else could see. Another man fell to his knees, covering his face with his hands, unable to continue. And I ask you, have you ever lived through a moment where everything seemed lost, but something inside you told you not to give up? This faith that springs up in the impossible is what sustained every Christian there. The enemy believed he would be victorious, but the collective cry was making room for the impossible miracle that was approaching. The stage of that miracle was not made of concrete, but a simple temple, transformed into a spiritual battlefield. Heaven was leaning in to listen, and those who prayed already knew. Something extraordinary was about to happen. The atmosphere was filled with the outcry. The voices of the faithful echoed like thunder inside the small church, while the invaders, previously dominated by fury, now showed insecurity. It was at this instant that something supernatural happened. Without anyone lighting lamps, an intense light invaded the temple. It did not come from the street, nor from the extinguished candles, but descended from above as if heaven itself had opened over them. The Christians, who were praying with their eyes closed, felt the gentle warmth of this light passing through their bodies. Many began to cry even harder, but not out of fear. It was reverence. The air changed, becoming light, as if the weight of terror had been lifted from their shoulders. The leader of the invaders tried to scream, but his voice failed. He looked around stunned and saw something that paralyzed him. A resplendent figure resembling a man dressed in white stood right behind the altar. The machete he was holding slipped from his hand, falling to the floor with a metallic crash. The other aggressors stepped back. Some stumbled, others simply dropped their weapons. One of them, terrified, fell to his knees and muttered, I can't fight this." The children, previously hidden, began to look curiously. One of them pointed and said aloud, without fear, "Mommy, look, it's an angel." The chorus of prayers turned into spontaneous singing. Men and women raised their arms, singing and praising the Lord. The figure of light remained still, but its presence was so strong that no enemy could remain standing. It was as if an invisible wall had risen inside the church and nothing could pass through it. Pastor Elias, with tears streaming down his face, declared in a loud voice, "This is proof that our God lives. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever." The remaining invaders tried to flee, but their legs were trembling so much that they could barely reach the door. The leader, already out of strength, fell to his knees and covered his face, muttering between sobs, this God is real." The fire that had started minutes earlier went out completely, as if it had never existed. The smell of smoke gave way to a soft, inexplicable fragrance that filled the room. The silence of violence was replaced by the sound of praises that echoed with even greater intensity. And I ask you who are following this story, how would you react if you were in that church, witnessing weapons falling to the ground and enemies retreating before a light that can only come from heaven? This is the strength of the impossible miracle. When everything seems lost, God shows that He has the final word. That night would not be forgotten. Everyone knew. The attack that was meant to destroy the faith of that community had become the stage for a divine manifestation. The silence that took over the church after that manifestation was almost palpable. No one dared to move, as if everyone was trapped in an eternal instant. The faithful, still kneeling, cried and sang softly, while the men who had entered to destroy could now barely support the weight of their own bodies. Some were bowed, others trembled, and there were even those who hid their faces in their hands, unable to look at what had just happened. Suddenly, one of them, the youngest in the group, began to sob. He dropped the piece of wood he was holding and fell to his knees right in the middle of the aisle. His tears flowed freely as he murmured in a low voice, I didn't know. Forgive me. Teach me to know this God." Pastor Elias slowly stood up, his face still illuminated by emotion, and approached the young man. He placed his hand on his head and said with a firm, yet compassionate voice, "He has already forgiven you, son. What you need now is to give your life to Him." Those words broke the last barriers in the young man's heart. He began to repeat simple phrases, asking for forgiveness and confessing that he no longer wanted to live as before. The emotional congregation extended their hands toward him and prayed in unison. It was impossible not to feel that something was profoundly changing, not only in that young man, but in everyone witnessing that scene. The leader of the group, who had previously shouted and threatened, was sitting on the floor, his eyes fixed on the altar. His breathing was heavy, and his slumped shoulders revealed a defeated man, but not by violence, but by the presence that hovered over that place. He tried to speak, but his voice failed. After a few seconds, he finally managed to murmur, "I can't deny what I saw. There's no explanation." Some of the faithful approached, offering water and even hugs. There was no resentment or hatred. On the contrary, there was a compassion that could only be born from hearts that knew forgiveness. The contrast was so great that the invaders themselves seemed even more confused. They came to hurt, but were being welcomed with love. The children, who had been crying earlier, now looked on curiously, as if trying to understand how those men who had brought fear minutes ago could now be broken. One of them, in an innocent voice, asked, "Mommy, are they going to sing with us now too?" The comment drew tears from several faces. And, in fact, that night ended in a way no one could ever imagine. Some of the aggressors, who entered with shouts and threats, joined the voices of the congregation, singing a gentle hymn together, which rose like a prayer of repentance. What was meant to be a night of pain turned into a gathering of restoration. There before everyone, it was clear that there were no human winners or losers. What there was something greater, something that touched even the hardest hearts. The first rays of sun shone through the cracks of the old building when the people finally got up from the floor. The night had been long, but no one wanted to leave. It was as if everyone knew that this moment marked the beginning of a new story. Some were still silent, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Others hugged their neighbors as if they needed to confirm they were alive. Outside, the news was already spreading. Those passing by the road noticed the unusual movement at the church and approached, curious. In a few hours, dozens of people who hadn't participated in the service were there, listening to the accounts with astonishment. Each testimony sounded more incredible than the last. Some talked about the light that descended. Others swore they saw a luminous figure next to the altar, and there were those who spoke of the fire that went out on its own. Everyone, however, agreed on one thing. The impossible had happened before their eyes. Pastor Elias, tired but with shining eyes, gathered the brothers and sisters in the churchyard and said, "My beloved, this night was not just about us. It was a clear message that nothing can extinguish faith when it is true. What we experienced here needs to be told, because many people still live in fear, thinking they are alone." The children, who were trembling with fear hours earlier, were now running in the yard as if nothing had happened. For them, the strongest memory would be the collective singing that smothered the fear. Some even imitated the adults, raising their hands and repeating phrases of prayer. The men who had entered to attack were transformed. Not all of them surrendered, it is true, but those who stayed could no longer deny what they had seen. The youngest, who asked for forgiveness in tears, now walked among the faithful, thanking them for every hug received. The leader, silent, still seemed to be in shock, but there was no more arrogance in his eyes. He was broken, and, in a way, that was already the beginning of something new. As the days passed, the testimony spread through the town and neighboring villages. In markets, schools, and even in the fields, everyone was talking about what had happened in that church. People who had never been interested in hearing about faith began to seek out the brothers and sisters to understand better. And the small congregation, previously fragile and hidden, now received visitors from all parts, attracted by the story of what they had called the night when light defeated darkness. And now I want to speak directly to you who have followed along. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments what moved you the most. Also tell us about an experience you've had, because your voice can strengthen someone who needs hope today. And if you are not yet part of this family, subscribe to the channel, not just as a spectator, but as someone who walks together in faith and testimony. Here, every story is an invitation to believe in the extraordinary. Are you ready to be a part of this journey?